During the 1960s and 70s, despite a decline in the number of people travelling by sea, passenger liners from around the world were still a common sight in British waters. Few could have imagined that within a few years many of the world's best-known ships would be laid up, sold to take on new roles, or even scrapped. Thanks to Southampton-based historian Barry J. Eagles, however, many of these vintage vessels were captured on film for us to enjoy decades later. So join us for some more classic liners, together with a special tribute to the much-admired Canberra. We begin our delve into the archive with the S.A. Val. Built by the John Brown shipyard of Clydeside, she was launched in 1961 as the Transvaal Castle and was in fact the last liner to be built for the Union Castle line. With a length of 760 feet and capacity for 728 passengers in one class, her maiden voyage between Southampton and Durban, South Africa, was in January 1962. Five years later, the 33,000-ton liner was transferred to the South African Marine Corporation and renamed. But in 1977, the famous Union Castle Cape Run came to an end, and in October that year she left Southampton for a major refit by the Kawasaki Engineering Company of Kobe, Japan, having been purchased by the Carnival Cruise Line. She emerged as the cruise liner Festival to take up cruising in the Caribbean, with her accommodation increased to 1,400. More recently, she was bought by Premier Cruises, refitted and renamed Island Breeze. Another ship which started life as a Union Castle vessel, later to receive a change of identity, was the S.A. Oranje. She was formerly the Pretoria Castle. Launched in 1947, she was built by Harland and Wolff of Belfast and was one of the first passenger cargo liners ordered by the Union Castle Line after the Second World War. The launching ceremony, which took place on the 19th of August 1947, was performed by the wife of the South African Prime Minister, Mrs. Jan Smuts. In itself, this was not exceptional, except that the proceedings were relayed by radio from South Africa, 6,000 miles away, with a bottle of wine smashed against the ship's bow by remote control. At the time of her going into service, she was the company's largest ever liner, so she assumed the role of flagship of the fleet. With her length of 747 feet and gross tonnage of nearly 29,000 tonnes, she could carry 214 passengers in first class and 542 in tourist. During her maiden voyage in July 1948, the new liner received a warm welcome from each of the South African ports along the way. Her presence signifying a strengthening of trade links between South Africa and Britain. And in Durban, some 500 school children from Pretoria were even given a guided tour. In 1965, Pretoria Castle returned to Belfast, where her passenger accommodation was improved and her appearance streamlined. This was achieved by replacing her mainmast with a small mast aft of the bridge and by shortening her foremast. Her appearance was further changed the following year, when she was transferred to SAF Marine, given new livery of white and grey and renamed S.A. Oranje. Although now sailing under the South African flag, Oranje was still operated by her British crew. She continued in service until the latter part of 1975, but sadly, in November of that year, the ship arrived in Taiwan to be broken up. Dressed overall, we see her here on the 19th of September 1975, making her final departure from Southampton. The German-built Astor II, with her capacity for 650 passengers, was ordered by the South African Marine Corporation in 1985 as part of a move by the company to reopen the Southampton to Cape run. But sanctions against South Africa at this time made this unworkable, so the 20,000-ton liner was sold to the Marion Corporation of Panama. She was sold again in October 1988, this time to the Black Sea Shipping Company of Odessa, and renamed Fedor Dostoevsky. The Greek liner Ellinis began life as one of 3 sister ships built for the Matson Navigation Line of San Francisco, and was launched as the Lurline in July 1932. Her maiden voyage, which followed in January 1933, was a world cruise, after which she settled into a regular route between San Francisco and Honolulu. From 1942, the 18,000-tonner, with her service speed of 22 knots, served as a troop ship, not returning to her peacetime route until April 1948. 15 years later, in 1963, she was sold to the Chandris Line of Greece and received the name Ellinis, which means Greek lady. Originally, she was designed to carry 550 first-class and 250 second-class passengers. But after a refit at North Shields to convert her to an immigrant ship for the Australian service, she was able to carry a total of 1,668 in one class. She later cruised out of Australia or in the Mediterranean from Genoa, but with an increase in fuel costs, she was eventually sold for scrapping in 1987. Some of her parts, incidentally, were installed in her remaining sister ship, Britannis, which we will see in a moment. Another of the Chandris Line ships, Australis, also underwent a great many changes. When launched in August 1939, it was as the United States Lines America, having been built by the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. She was designed for the transatlantic service, but due to the outbreak of war in Europe, her initial voyages were confined to cruising in American waters. In 1941, she was taken over by the United States Navy, refitted as a troop ship and renamed West Point, a role in which she would continue until July 1946. Following the war, with her livery, interiors and name restored, she made her first long-awaited transatlantic voyage from New York to Le Havre. The crossing took 4 days, 22 hours and 22 minutes, and was in fact a record time for an American ship. During the ensuing 18 years, America made a further 287 crossings and carried nearly 500,000 passengers. But in November 1964, she was sold to the Chandris Group, who wanted to put her to work on their new service between Southampton and Sydney. After a £3 million refit, which was completed in Piraeus, port of Athens, she emerged as Australis, which means Australian lady. The 723-foot liner was as successful as ever in her new career, making 61 round trips in 11 years, carrying over 250,000 passengers. In 1977, she made her last voyage on this run, after which she was sold by Chandris to an American firm for $5 million, who changed her name back to SS America. They soon went bankrupt, however, and Chandris bought the ship back at auction for a mere $1 million and put her to work in the Mediterranean as the Italis, having first removed one of her funnels. Unfortunately, this too was unsuccessful, so she was sold again, this time to a Swiss-backed company who renamed her Noga. Several other changes of ownership and names followed, and finally, whilst under tow, she ran aground off Portaventura in the Canary Islands, where she remains, gradually being pounded to pieces by the waves. Recorded here in September 1977, the 4,000-ton Argonaut was built in 1929 by Friedrich Krupp of Germany, originally as one of the world's largest private yachts. Over the years, she has been refitted and cruised in the Mediterranean for a number of companies, carrying up to 270 passengers at a time. Like Argonaut, the Orpheus, of similar proportions, was purchased by the Eparatiki line. Having entered service in 1948 as the ferry Munster for the British and Irish Steam Packet Company, she was sold and moved to Piraeus in 1968, where she was renamed and underwent a 2-year conversion to become a cruise ship. In 1970, Orpheus made her first cruise from Seattle to Alaska, after which she cruised in the Med for several companies, including Swan Hellenic. More recently, in 1997, she was transferred to the combined Epiratiki and Sunlines fleet, known as Royal Olympic Cruises. The third of our trio from the Eparatiki line is Atlas. Her modern appearance belies the fact that she dates back to 1950. She first served as the Dutch liner Rheindamm for the Holland America line, working the North Atlantic run, and was in fact by the early 1970s the oldest passenger vessel in their fleet. Having been sold to Eparatiki Lines, she was completely remodelled and given extra aft deck areas, open-air pools and a new lease of life as the cruise liner Atlas. With her length of 510 feet, the 15,000-ton steamship soon proved popular, working in various parts of the world, including the Aegean, Scandinavia, Caribbean and South America. She was sold and renamed several times in later years, eventually to be purchased by an hotel based in Reno, Nevada, and become permanently moored in Gulfport, Mississippi. She has now been renamed Copa Casino and has been fitted out with a new restaurant, 700 slot machines and 45 gaming tables. Seen here in Istanbul, the Ithaca, with her length of 501 feet, was built as the Zim in 1955. It wasn't until 1972, in fact, that she became Ithaca, cruising the Mediterranean with her running mate Calypso, formerly the Southern Cross, for the Ulysses line. Daphne of Caras Cruises started life not as a passenger liner, but as a freighter named Port of Sydney, launched in 1955 to work on the meat run between Britain and Australasia. In 1972, the 16,000-ton vessel was transformed into a passenger ship and renamed. embarking on her first cruise in July 1974 from Marseille around the Mediterranean. After several changes of ownership, she was bought in 1996 by the Swiss company Leisure Cruises, who renamed her Switzerland. The elegant 18,000-ton Britannis was sister ship to Elenis, formerly the Lure Line, which we saw earlier. Like her sister, she was built for the Matson Navigation Company of San Francisco, in her case as Monterey, to serve the route between San Francisco and Honolulu. Her maiden voyage took place on the 12th of May, 1932. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, she was taken over by the US Navy as troop transport, and following the war and a period of layup, she re-entered her old service in May 1957 as the Matsonia. In 1970, she was purchased by Chandris Lines and refitted in Piraeus, and in February the following year embarked on her new career as Britannis. After many years of cruising, she was moored off Guatemala Bay, Cuba, and used as accommodation to Cubans wishing to emigrate to the United States. Like most of the ships we've seen so far, Navarino previously sailed under another flag. In her case, it was as the Gripsholm for the Swedish America Line. At 23,000 tons, she was built in Italy in 1956, with accommodation for 842 passengers. Her maiden voyage of May 1957 took her from Gothenburg to New York. It wasn't until 1974 that she came under Greek ownership and was given the name Navarino, which was after a Greek battle at sea won against Turkey. In later years, there was a series of unfortunate incidents. A grounding, a serious fire in which a section of passenger accommodation was destroyed, and a severe flooding when a dry dock in which she was being repaired sank. This nearly resulted in her being declared a total loss. Thankfully, however, she was salvaged and refurbished. She was later known as Samantha under multi-ship Italia, and then Regent Sea for Regency Cruises. But in 1998 she became Topaz when she was bought by Thompson Cruises. With her modern profile, the much more recently constructed Crown Odyssey is of a new breed. Built in Papenburg, Germany, she was floated out of a building dock on the 1st of November 1987 for Royal Cruise Line. With a gross tonnage of 32,000 tons, she is able to accommodate 1,209 passengers and is operated by a crew of 443. Her 4 geared diesel engines produce nearly 29,000 brake horsepower, enabling her to cruise at 22 knots. More recently, in 1996, she was sold to NCL, becoming Norwegian Crown. The first of our Italian liners is the 20,000-ton Frederico C of the Coaster Line, launched in 1957. With a length of 606 feet, she was powered by 2 sets of geared turbines and equipped with twin screws which delivered a cruising speed of 21 knots. She originally had a capacity for 243 first, 300 second and 736 third-class passengers. Her maiden voyage of March 1958 took her from Genoa to Buenos Aires. She continued under this guise for a number of years and was later sold to Premier Cruises in 1983 and renamed Royale. With another change of ownership, she became Starship Royale, after which she became Seabreeze One and placed under the management of the Dolphin Cruise Line. The Fair Star, launched in 1955, began her career as the troopship Oxfordshire. But after a lay-up during the 1960s, she was first chartered and then bought outright by the Sitmar Group, converted into a full-time cruise ship and renamed. In 1988, she was sold to P&O Shipping, along with the rest of the Sitmar ships, after which she spent the next 9 years cruising out of Sydney before being scrapped in 1997. Another of the Coaster Line ships, Eugenio C, was launched in November 1964. With a gross tonnage of over 30,000 tonnes, she could originally cater for 1,636 passengers over 3 classes. She later received a name change, becoming Eugenio Coaster, and in 1994 she was sold and given the name Edinburgh Castle. Achille Lauro is unfortunately a name that many may remember for negative reasons. The conversion of the former 23,000-ton Dutch vessel William Rice, which was to become Laro Line's new ship, hit the headlines in August 1965, long before she entered service, when a severe fire wrecked a great deal of the conversion work being carried out at Palermo, Sicily. Despite the damage, the repairs and conversion were continued, and a year later than first anticipated, the newly refitted Achille Lauro emerged. 2 decades later, she was in the news again for a very different reason, when she was the subject of a hijacking. And in 1994, she finally caught fire and sank, with the loss of 3 lives. The name Chota Rustaveli has something of an Italian ring to it, but this ship, with her capacity to carry 750 passengers, is in fact the first of our Russian liners. She is one of 5 sisters built in what was East Germany for the Soviet Union. With a length of 577 feet and gross tonnage of 19,500 tonnes, she was launched in 1967 and was delivered by her builders, the Matthias Thiessen Yard of Weimar, on the 30th of June the following year. Until the breakup of the Soviet Union, the elegantly proportioned Chota Rustaveli cruised out of England and Australia, with many of her voyages departing from Tilbury or Southampton on charter to the CTC cruise line, which in itself is now inoperative. More recently, Chota Rustaveli has been laid up near the Black Sea port of Odessa. This fascinating sequence was filmed by Barry Eagles during the mid-1970s. If the profile of the Leonid Sobinov seems familiar, it's hardly surprising. She was once part of the famous Cunard Quartet of liners and was launched by Lady Churchill as Saxonia in 1954. Each of the quartet had a length of 608 feet and gross tonnage of 22,000 tonnes. They were designed to cater mainly for the immigrant trade, taking people from Britain to Canada to begin a new life. After a stint on the New York-Liverpool service, Cunard decided that she and her sister ship, Ivernia, should be refitted to undertake a new role as cruise ships. She was also given a change of name, becoming the Carmania. By 1970, through financial pressure, Carmania was taken out of service and put up for sale. She was eventually purchased by the Russian Black Sea Shipping Company, who renamed her again. For the following 16 years, Leonid Sobinov cruised from Australia and Southampton with a few troop transporting duties along the way, carrying Cuban troops to Angola. In 1990, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, her ownership transferred to the Trans-Blasco 4 shipping company, and she was re-registered in Malta. But 5 years later, she was taken out of service and laid up near Odessa. Built as the German liner Hamburg, Maxim Gorky went into service in 1969. It was after only 5 years that she was sold to the Black Sea Shipping Company and renamed. On one eventful cruise in June 1989, she was holed by drifting ice and her passengers placed in lifeboats for safety. Fortunately, however, the 25,000-ton liner was able to be towed to Spitsbergen for temporary repairs. Built specifically for the Soviet Union, Mikhail Kalinin of 1958 was the lead ship of a class of 19. Most of her career, which ended when she was broken up in 1994, was spent cruising, but she also made trips to Antarctica on behalf of the Russian scientific bases. She's seen here in Istanbul. One of the sister ships to Chota Rustaveli was Ivan Franko. Like her sister ship, she also cruised out of Tilbury and Southampton for CTC cruises, and after the breakup of the Soviet Union, she too was laid up in the Black Sea. As in the case of Leonid Sobinov, Fyodor Shalapin was once part of the Cunard Quartet, a fact underlined by her unmistakable domed funnel, characteristic of the class. In fact, the careers of the two sisters are remarkably similar. The latter entered service as Ivernia in June 1955 as part of Cunard's Liverpool-Montreal service, carrying up to 110 first-class and 833 tourist-class passengers. She too underwent a complete refit in 1963 to convert her for a new role as cruise ship. This was carried out at the John Brown Yard on the Clyde, where the ships had been built, and the result was upgraded bathroom facilities, air conditioning and a large pool in the aft Lido area. And as well as new green livery, she too received a new name, emerging as Franconia. In 1973, she was sold to the Soviet State Shipping Company to become Fyodor Shalapin and began a new career cruising out of various European ports and Australia, as well as joining her former running mate in transporting Cuban troops to Angola. In later years, she was also laid up near Odessa. Earlier in the programme we saw SAF Marine's Astor. Here we see her again a few years later under another identity as the Black Sea Shipping Company's Fedor Dostoyevsky. Another change occurred in 1995, however, when she was purchased by the Astor Shipping Company and once again named Astor. With her very traditional looks, the small Norwegian liner Saga Fjord enjoyed great popularity as part of the fleet of the Norwegian America Line of Oslo. At 24,000 tons with a length of a little over 600 feet, she was launched in June 1964, with her maiden voyage from Oslo to New York taking place in October the following year. During the ensuing years, the French-built Saga Fjord won a great deal of repeat business, with loyal passengers returning time and time again for deluxe world cruises or voyages around Europe, the Pacific or Mediterranean, according to the time of year. Some passengers even lived aboard for several months at a time, meeting up with old friends and acquaintances along the way. In 1980, during a refit at the German Blohm & Voss yard of Hamburg, an additional deck was built on her aft, and 3 years later, ownership was transferred to the Cunard Steamship Company, with her port of registration changed to Nassau. In 1996, Saga Fjord was chartered to Transocean, who chose to rename her Gripsholm. And this was followed by a more permanent change when she was sold to the Saga Group, who renamed her Saga Rose. With a capacity for 589, she now caters specifically for passengers over the age of 50. Another of the Norwegian America fleet, and approximately the same size as Saga Fjord, was Vista Fjord. Unlike her sister ship, however, she was built by Swan Hunter of Wallsend-on-Tyne. She was launched in May 1972, with her maiden voyage from Oslo to New York commencing a year later. Powered by two 9-cylinder diesel engines and capable of cruising at 20 knots, she too was sold to Cunard and re-registered in Nassau in the Bahamas in May 1983. The last of our Norwegian ships is the liner Royal Viking Sea, built for the Royal Viking Line of Oslo and launched in January 1973. In 1991, having previously been registered under the ownership of Kloster Cruises of Nassau, she was renamed Royal Odyssey. Without question, the P&O vessel Canberra has left her mark in maritime history and a lasting impression on ship lovers and passengers alike. For many years, her distinctive profile was a familiar sight as she embarked and disembarked at her home port of Southampton. The disembarkation of passengers and their belongings, the replenishment of supplies, preparations for the next voyage, and the welcoming of hundreds of new passengers completed each time in a matter of hours. For every passenger, even the most experienced, the point of departure is a moment of excitement as a new adventure is begun. On such a classic liner, it was often an occasion in its own right. For her crew, it may have been a matter of routine, but many had worked aboard for years and had consequently developed a great affection for the old ship as she neared her final months. Her story began in the 1950s when Harland and Wolff of Belfast were commissioned to build a revolutionary new liner for P&O's Australia service. In a time when travel by sea was not entirely overshadowed by the jet age, the new £17 million ship was to work as part of the world's transport system. Constructed on the same dock which had seen the building of Titanic, the new liner was launched by Dame Patty Menzies, wife of the Australian Prime Minister, on the 16th of March 1960. Having first been fitted out, Canberra arrived in Southampton for the first time in May the following year. At 45,000 tonnes, she was the biggest liner to be built in Britain since Queen Elizabeth in 1940, and the largest ever to be built for any route other than the North Atlantic. With accommodation for 2,212 passengers in two classes, technically she was designed to carry a similar number to the Lizzie, which was nearly double her size. With her engines and exhaust trunkings located aft, she was able to offer much more deck space than usual, a feature particularly appreciated as she passed through the warmer stages of her route. And her design also allowed greater flexibility in the way in which her public rooms could be laid out. In the 1960s, Canberra carried out a mixed programme of cruises and line voyages, during which thousands of Britons were carried to Australia, emigrating under the Assisted Passage Scheme, whereby they paid £10 towards the cost of their passage. By the end of the decade, however, the number of immigrants began to decline, and in 1970 the first Boeing 747 entered commercial service. Canberra would not be a viable proposition in the service for which she was intended, and a new role would have to be found for her. Full-time cruising was the obvious alternative, and so during the early 1970s a series of cruises from both Southampton and New York was offered. But after operating unprofitably for 2 years, it was announced by P&O that Canberra was to be withdrawn. However, just a matter of weeks later, the decision was reversed due to a sudden demand for open-class cruising. With a world cruise each year from January to April, she began to gain a long list of repeat passengers. One couple even made every one of her world cruises in the comfort of a deluxe suite. After 36 years in service, Canberra had become a familiar sight in many ports around the world. In 1997 alone, her cruise programme took her to the Med, the Atlantic Islands, the Baltic and Norwegian fjords, and the Caribbean. On the 30th of September, she steamed towards Southampton for her last spectacular homecoming. Although not due to arrive until around 10:30, crowds began to gather much earlier at vantage points such as the pier at Hythe and the quay near berth 106, the Mayflower cruise terminal. Before entering Southampton Water, Canberra had met with several vessels of the Royal Navy off Nab Tower, a rendezvous somewhat spoilt by the mist of that morning. In fact, visibility was so poor it was feared that the whole occasion would be marred. But in the event, as the ship steamed past Calshot and into Southampton Water, the mist began to lift. In addition to her official escort of 2 fireboats, the Southampton port launch and police launches, followed by HMS Cornwall, dozens of other craft turned out to meet the liner for the last few miles of her final voyage. The presence of the forces at the occasion was acknowledgement of the role Canberra played in the Falklands campaign. It was during the last leg of her 1982 world cruise that news came of the conflict and the part the ship was to play. 3 days after arriving back in Southampton, having been hurriedly converted to helicopter and troop carrier, she was bound for the South Atlantic with a complement of over 3,000 personnel. 4 months later, on the 11th of July, the Great White Whale, as she was nicknamed, returned to a hero's welcome and extensive refit. During this triumphant welcome, passengers rather than personnel watched events unfold. As they sipped champagne, 16,000 biodegradable balloons were released, adding even further colour to the proceedings. By now, with the mist lifting further, a great air of excitement and celebration had developed not only on board, but among the flotilla of small boats and ashore. Without doubt, this was a scene reminiscent of similar occasions decades previously, when other great names in maritime history made their first or final entries to a major port. And for many, especially those who had travelled aboard, this was the closing of a chapter, as one of the last great ships left from a past era took a final bow.
Well, actually, we cruised 5 times on Canberra, the first one being back in 1974. Since then I've done 4 with my wife, and we were lucky enough to take the children on the last 2. It's a very sad occasion. I mean, it's the end of an era. You'll never see her likes again. Ships aren't built like her anymore. They're more floating hotels. But she's got a lot of character and nostalgia with her.
Yeah, it's very sad. Very sad. It's a lovely ship. It's just a beautiful, beautiful sight. Lovely.
And I think on an occasion like this, when the ship goes, we're also losing part of us as well.
It's just a fantastic ship. Traditional, yeah, very, very emotional.
As Lynx helicopters of the Army Air Corps made their flypast, the flotilla waited patiently at 106 berth, whilst Canberra was turned. Elsewhere, HMS Cornwall was holding her position opposite Mayflower Park, where there was a gun salute and a parachute landing by the Red Devils. Nine bars, 5 dance floors, 3 swimming pools, 2 restaurants, a library, shops, 7,350 square metres of open deck space and accommodation for 1,750 passengers, capable of travelling at 27.5 knots around the world. No wonder in the 1960s she was considered the ship of the decade. During her 36 years of service, P&O estimate Canberra has sailed more than 3 million miles and carried nearly 1 million passengers, some 6,500 troops and over 3,000 prisoners of war. But the sad fact remained that despite her popularity, the older she became, the greater the risk of mechanical breakdown. Her last voyage, a sellout within 48 hours of being announced, was a 20-night trip which included Istanbul, Athens, Naples and Parma, destinations she had visited on many occasions previously. As the final few moments of Canberra's last commercial voyage drew near, excitement gave way to sadness. By 12:15 the liner was alongside, and to the accompaniment of the bands of the Royal Marines and the Parachute Regiment, her captain signalled, "Finished with engines." Mabel Johnson of Newport travelled aboard Canberra nearly 40 times. What did she make of that final cruise?
The atmosphere on this last 3 weeks has been absolutely marvellous. It's been one big party atmosphere, but this morning coming up Southampton Water, the emotions crept in and we were, people were very sad and we've gone through an awful lot of tissues, I'm afraid.
And what were the feelings of the ship's master at this historic moment?
One of elation and a little tinge too of sadness that the career of a great liner is now finished. But the elation is that the welcome that she had by so many people, thousands of people all along Southampton Water, into the harbour and Town Quay, Mayflower Park, all the way up the docks. That meant something, that those 36 years had produced a great love and affection for her, and from our point of view, those of us that are living on her and working on her now, it was all worthwhile.
As the last of her passengers' luggage was unloaded and the crowds went home, Canberra's future was yet to be announced. But 3 weeks later, she was to make her very last voyage. Pakistan and the Breakers.